What I was thinking is that we were going to start out with Ukrainian strikes on Russian early warning radar sites, and then we'll move to a discussion of specific focus on Germany on their revision of the targeting restrictions on Ukraine with regard to Russia. So to start it off, Fabian, as sort of a general overview, and Erland, if you could pull up that one overall radar coverage map, as someone in strategic studies, what's your in sort of the abstract here? We have a non-nuclear armed state attacking the early warning infrastructure of a nuclear armed state. What are your sort of first impressions in the abstract of this situation?
Sure. So what you can see here is the strategic early warning network of the Russian Federation, at least the ground-based one. This is also supported by a space-based satellite network. As far as I know, it's 4 operational geostationary satellites that can also assist in terms of picking up signatures of ICBM launches from the United States and potential other nuclear weapon states. But this ground-based strategic early warning network that is really intended to pick up the signatures of incoming ICBM warheads as they are on their terminal approach onto the country. And so the basic idea behind that, of course, is that if you are attacked, you know it's coming and you can react. And that's especially important for a country like the Russian Federation, which has a launch under warning posture, meaning that officially, according to its posture, its doctrine, it's not intending to ride out an enemy first strike, but it is intending to react to the incoming first strike as it is happening and launching a retaliatory strike. And so the issue then is, right, if you destroy this early warning network, you might blind, or you will blind the adversary, the nuclear weapon state, hindering that nuclear weapon state from taking appropriate action in time. And given, right, that since at least the second half of the Cold War, we've basically accepted with the Russian Federation, in terms of policy, mutually assured destruction and the objective of strategic stability. We're not necessarily planning on, or at least, I mean, it's a bit ambiguous, but at least officially, once in a while we reaffirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and should therefore not be fought. And if that's the case, we want to be in a very stable environment, if possible, with our nuclear adversaries. And if I now go after my adversary's ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, including strategic early warning, that might be highly destabilizing. So if you take that into account, that can explain why from some states, especially the United States, also Germany, the reactions were quite intense, and why they reacted in a very hostile manner to this new targeting policy from Ukraine.
Thank you. So to kind of move a little bit deeper into the specifics here, Erland, if you could pull up the map for Armavir. Yes, that one. Thank you. So obviously, a little bit earlier, well, technically last month now, in early May, Ukraine obviously executed this raid and damaged both of the emitters at the Armavir site, the 2 Voronezh DM early warning radars. What sort of, and obviously we've talked about this privately, and we have some differing impressions here, but what's sort of your overview as to what the Ukrainian rationale here is for targeting these sites?
Sure. So I'm pretty sure at this point it had a dual purpose. I think one was directly related to theater operations in Ukraine. So what you see here, right, is that the radar coverage is partially covering the south of Ukraine, including Crimea. It's a bit difficult to tell, where exactly to which area the radar coverage extends. I've seen some analysis suggesting, right, that it covers a bit more in Ukraine, also further north. But I think that's without proper analysis and maybe even classified information, that's really difficult to fully uncover where the radar coverage ends. But I think there's a good case to be made that this strategic early warning radar, which primarily plays a role in looking out for incoming ICBM warheads can also play a role for theater operations in Ukraine, in particular, picking up launches of ATACMS maneuvering ballistic missiles. Given that their apogee is, as far as I know, somewhere between 65 and 75 kilometers on a normal trajectory, that should certainly be outside the radar shadow created by that early warning radar and inside the coverage. So signatures of that should be picked up. There's a bit of an argument, or people are arguing, to what extent this radar is integrated into the overall early warning network, also for tactical operational forces in Ukraine, so not just the Russian strategic forces. And I think whether or not it's fully integrated, I mean, it definitely can probably play a role to some extent, at least in early warning. I mean, worst case, it's just an operator, manually basically telling S400, S300 units to turn on their radars because bearing XYZ, there's an incoming threat. So I think in that sense, there's a good case to be made that probably this radar played a role in theater operations, and so there is value in taking it out just from a military perspective. Although again, right, the full value I do not fully understand, because that's just we're lacking a bit the information here, at least I. So that's one factor, military factor, and I think there's also a second one, and that's a very political factor. I think engaging these types of targets for Ukraine is part of a broader asymmetric counter-escalation strategy. So as Russia escalates that conflict horizontally and vertically all over again, so it's broadening the scope and the intensity of the war, it's quite difficult to keep up for Ukraine in a symmetric fashion, and to find appropriate answers, both because it doesn't have the means, it does not have the same missile manufacturing capabilities, the same arsenal depth, and of course it's also hampered by targeting restrictions imposed by Western states when it comes to using their weapon systems. And so what Ukraine needs to do is they want to find a way to respond to Russian escalation in an asymmetric manner, in which they can still inflict significant cost on Russia, while also with being within their means. And these strategic early warning radars, they are very important pieces of infrastructure for a nuclear weapon state like Russia. They are rather hard to replace in today's environment, but at the same time, they're also soft targets, right? They're not armored, they're hardened, they're not buried. They're rather fragile pieces of technology standing in the open. And as far as we know, or what we've seen repeatedly, Russia has had difficulties protecting its infrastructure. So it was also basically an open target. And what Ukraine said, look, this is a great target to engage in order to send a message to Russia that so Ukraine, still has options to inflict pain where it hurts, while at the same time, this of course also sends a message to the United States and to other Western partners that independent of their targeting restrictions, independent of their weapon deliveries, Ukraine is capable of pursuing certain targeting strategies fully autonomously, whether or not Western partners like that. So I think it was overall this dual purpose of achieving military effects while also sending political signals both to Russia and to Western partners.
Thank you, Erland. If you could go to the map for Orsk, just to, I guess maybe to rehash in some form the little bit of the discussion we had privately the other week. My sort of read of it is particularly taking into account the attempted raid, as it doesn't appear it was successful, on the southern facing Voronezh Imset in outside Orsk in Orenburg Oblast, so just north of Kazakhstan. I've come to strongly suspect that political component really outweighs the military component in the Ukrainian calculus, because that that Voronezh Imset has no bearing on operations in Ukraine. And I think specifically what they're attempting to do is, and I know you have a slightly different view of it, which I'd love to hear as a counter to mine, that the Ukrainians are deliberately being coercive towards their Western allies, the United States in particular, in engaging target sets that the U.S. administration does not want them to. We saw this with the raids, which are obviously still continuing on the Russian hydrocarbon industry, which sparked a lot of ire, both publicly and privately. I think publicly, anyway, certainly more than the early warning radar strikes in any case, about those targeting practices and sort of our domestic political concerns there. But I think that an analogy can be drawn there, in that I strongly suspect the Ukrainians are trying to send a very specific signal to the White House, saying that we need the capacity to be able to strike relevant military targets in Russia to defend ourselves prior to just the past 48, 72 hours. That was not the case, of course. And what they're trying to say is, if you want to have a say in how we prosecute targets in Russia and what targets we prosecute, then we need to be using your weapons to do that, if you want to be able to have realistic leverage there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. This is definitely part of coercive messaging of Ukraine towards the United States, making clear to US decision makers that by not delivering the weapon systems and the numbers that we would like to see, and then especially imposing targeting restrictions outside of Ukrainian territory, signaling to US decision makers that they have themselves kind of locked out of the targeting cycle. So they no longer have a say which kinds of targets are now engaged on Russian territory. And I think, right, this is the message that they're trying to send. And if you want to regain some control over the types of infrastructure targets we're looking at, then you better deliver the weapon systems that we need and also lift some of your targeting restrictions. So I fully understand the rationale behind this strategy. As I've pointed out, my concern is that the propensity to panic in DC is greater than the propensity to learn. So in that sense, I'm not sure how successful this strategy will be in the end, and I'm quite concerned that it will in the end actually backfire.
Yeah, the sort of the counter argument that I make there is, the continuing line from primarily from the United States has been that if Ukraine does not toe the line that we want them to, we will terminate security assistance. That has mainly been the threat behind, or how we've been enforcing the previous targeting restrictions against using Western and other allied provided weapons inside Russia proper. The way I've kind of been thinking about it is, on the one hand, the White House could simply, just not respond to Ukrainian messaging here and just uphold the status quo, and Ukraine can continue to pursue these raids. In that case, or, well, I should back up a little and say, I'm not sure their main area of leverage here, again, which is terminating security assistance. I'm not sure how credible that is a threat that they can make in this case, if it's Ukraine targeting Russian early warning infrastructure with Ukrainian assets, because they can obviously ignore the message and not change anything. But if they actively want it to stop, that's really their only leverage, aside from acceding to Ukrainian demands.
Yeah, I honestly think a lot will depend on whether this remains rather isolated strikes. Then it's pretty clear that it was mostly done for these types of signaling effects, coercive effects, or if this becomes part of a broader campaign effort. So, for example, if we see repeated attempts at the early warning radar in Orenburg region, here on the map, then I think that's when we get into territory where probably a stronger, or would we at least would get into territory where a stronger reaction on the US side might be warranted from their perspective. I think right now, if it just stays with these two instances, with this one destroyed radar, and with an attempt at the other one, I don't think it will change a lot. I mean, in the end, we don't know exactly, right, how this is perceived in the White House. I will just say that, coming from an academic perspective, the concept of strategic stability and then the concept of crisis stability, right, which is not giving your adversary an incentive to strike first in a crisis, that is deeply, deeply ingrained within US political discourse. And there is a body of literature that dates back 6.5 decades. And the Joint Chief of Staff, they have a directorate for strategic stability. So it's not even just an academic concept. It's deeply integrated within policy. And so, coming from that perspective, I can see, or at least I clearly perceive a case how there are a lot of people right now inside the administration that are putting heavy pressure on Ukraine to seize these types of strikes. Right, whether or not I believe this is right or wrong. First of all, I think that's fully up to the Ukrainians what they want to strike and what not. But I'm pretty sure right now they're receiving a lot of pushback for what they've done, and so I'm not sure if we will see more of that in the future.
One final thing, I guess, before we shift over to the targeting restrictions themselves, with regard to Germany, Erland, if you could pull up that overall map again.
The first one.
Yes. Thank you. The one other thing, Fabian, that I was sort of thinking about the other day is, do you think that there is in regard to the specific early warning radars that Ukraine could conceivably target, obviously Armavir was sort of a matter of convenience in terms of its location, Orsk as well. But there are, the early warning radar, for example, in St. Petersburg. That's pretty similar distance from Orsk, for example. Do you think that there would be a different reaction, for example, if Ukraine began to target the early warning radars directly facing, say, North America and the continental United States?
Yeah, I think so. So first of all, I think it would be different because, as I just said, then it would be clear it's not just isolated attempts at striking this type of infrastructure, but it's part of a broader counter ISR campaign effort, counter strategic ISR campaign effort, however you want to call it. And then especially if you strike adjacent strategic early warning radars, then you would build an attack corridor, right? And I think that would be seen as highly destabilizing. I mean, again, in general, from a strategic stability perspective, if this is what truly motivates you, ISR is basically the second worst type of target that you can engage. Second only to direct nuclear capabilities of your adversary. So if it turns out that let's say these early warning radars that should be absolutely in range of Ukraine right now and that are facing more towards the direction of the United States, North America, or also Greenland, the Arctic, I think pressure would be mounting on Ukraine to seize these types of attacks. However, difficult to say how exactly this would materialize. But again, I'm rather concerned that the reaction would be quite allergic and hence quite drastic.
Thank you. And then, so I guess to pivot to the targeting restrictions or the revision in policy from Germany, I find this particularly interesting, and I'm so happy that not just you, but obviously German aid to Ukraine is here as well to discuss this. We saw for the longest time the strong opposition from Scholz and the German government to Ukrainian strikes in Russia generally, but obviously with Western provided weapons in particular, that was obviously very strong. And of course, that over the past 72, 96 hours, that's fallen away like sand as the U.S. revised its policy. I think many others had the impression that Germany was sort of leading the U.S., not necessarily in terms of determining policy, but in terms of the strength of their opposition to Ukraine conducting strikes in Russia with donated weapons. But again, the past week has seemingly revealed that it's the opposite, that Germany is just completely mirroring U.S. policy in this regard. And I'm very curious what your sort of take on this is.
Yeah, it is all about the United States in that regard, I would say. It's absolutely mirroring US policy, and Germany was fully waiting for the United States. The United States, when it comes to lifting these types of targeting restrictions, is by far the most important actor. That is because the United States is, realistically speaking, within NATO, the only country that can fully respond to any drastic escalation on the Russian side, which I think is unlikely, and I would say the Ukrainians probably also believe it's rather unlikely to see drastic escalatory coercive steps in response to widening the targeting radius on Russian territory. But of course, it's not zero. And if that's the case, you need to have someone to back you up when you take these steps, especially as you potentially strike politically sensitive targets. And this backup, really, there's only one country who can fully provide that, and that's the United States, especially when it comes to, how would we react if Russia would start signaling a greater willingness to go to the nuclear level. I mean, in that regard, both due to their nuclear force posture and their conventional capabilities, European states would be rather hard-pressed to find appropriate answers to that. And that's why you have to have the United States on board. And I think that's why it's so incredibly important for Germany to go after the United States has taken that step. And that's, for example, also the case why Ukraine, even though I'm pretty sure the French by now have, probably allowed them to strike pretty much whatever target they want, inside or outside Russia, with their scalps, why they're still not engaging certain types of targets, because the Americans have made clear that they would not accept that. And that tells the Ukrainians that, look, if something bad could happen in response, if drastic escalatory measures could be taken, we may not have the full backing of the United States. And that's just something that Ukraine wants to avoid. So yeah, when it comes to lifting targeting restrictions, I think all eyes are on the United States. And by far, that is the most important actor in that regard.
Right. And I guess the aspect of it that gives me pause, the thing that I understand at least, is, I guess, the apparent lack of of public pressure from the German government on the U.S. government to revise these policies. If presumably Scholz was willing to endorse these policy revisions the entire time, obviously that sort of bled out into the public with the Leopard 2 and Abrams debacle towards the end of 2022. But the German government, up until the very, very last moment, didn't look like there was any, public pressure that they supported a policy change. And then all of a sudden, it just changes overnight. That's the one thing that I'm sort of struggling to get a handle on.
Yeah, so I think my assumption is that it's just pretty clear that Germany is incredibly risk averse, and Germany probably, at least the decision making centers inside the chancellery, so Scholz and his entourage, they probably perceive the risk of this war escalating to a broader confrontation between NATO and Russia as a greater risk than Ukraine losing this war. And if that's the case, right, your number one priority, your number one objective is to keep escalatory pressures low and to not take any risks. And as I've just said, I think widening or lifting the targeting restrictions, the risks that come with that, at least initially, they're really minuscule, but they're not zero. And so what you need are decision makers, like I think Macron has kind of understood that, right, I have to weigh risks. I cannot fully avoid risk taking. Both helping Ukraine has risks as much as not helping Ukraine has risks. And And I think Macron and British decision makers, for example, they have made the assessment that the risks of a Ukrainian defeat for the European continent would be greater than the risks of helping Ukraine right now. And I think in the Chancellery in Berlin, that risk assessment still looks very different. They still believe probably that the larger risks relate to escalatory pressures rather than Ukrainian defeat. And I think that can then explain why Scholz was probably quite happy with the United States position on not lifting those targeting restrictions, because they probably, or I'm pretty sure that they foresee quite substantial risks, right? I think their risk assessment is quite different when it comes to this policy change. And I think they've changed it then rather reluctantly, simply because after the United States has made that policy change, it was pretty much unfeasible or not feasible for Germany to continue down that path in isolation, because that's also something that German decision makers really want to avoid, I think.
Right. So in other words, it's not necessarily so much that Germany supported, or Scholz specifically supported, a policy revision, just didn't voice that publicly. It's more so they were opposed to it. The U.S. administration made a decision to revise our approach, and Scholz had all said, in for a penny, in for a pound. If the U.S. is committing to this, we may as well.
Yes, that would be pretty much my assessment. Yes. I'm like to add to that, I'm pretty sure that if the US had not made that policy change, I'm pretty sure that German policy would also not have changed until today.
Yeah, and that's sort of been my assumption as well. Germany to Ukraine, is there anything else you wanted to sort of add to that?
No, I like mostly agree with what Fabian said. I just want to add that I do agree when Fabian says when the US policy wouldn't change, German policy wouldn't have changed. But I want to add that, at least to my perspective, I'm following basically all of the press conferences Scholz is attending and statements and whatever, right? And from what my understanding was, at least it felt to me that way. He spoke days prior, not a lot of days prior, because there was a statement like 3 or 4 days before Germany authorized the limited strikes, where he said, basically said it's not going to happen, but kind of avoided the question. But 1 and 2 days before the US, or we got the reports here in Germany, I believe very late in the evening, that the US is allowing limited strikes. There was already some, at least it felt like to me, some kind of yeah, I mean, it would be good to do that, and it would be the right way, and Ukraine has all the right under international law, blah blah blah. But kind of avoiding really answering the question, like really answering it. And to me, it really felt like the Leopard 2 drama back then you talked about, or you mentioned earlier, because back then it was the same basically with the Leopard 2s. It was very first, no, it's not going to we're not going to do it, it's a red line, no tanks from Germany for Ukraine. And then it was kind of a little bit of change in communication, at least, and it wasn't so sure that Germany isn't doing it, also because of public pressure from other countries. And as soon as it was clear that the US is going to deliver Abrams, Germany was also on board and announced that it would be delivering Leopard tanks. And it felt like the same, that maybe the decision, or they already knew, all of them, that it would be the right thing to do and it needs to happen at some point. But as Fabian mentioned, like without the US actually allowing it to, we wouldn't have never done it. That's just my understanding from the situation.
Yeah,
you know what I tried to say with that.
Yes, I'm tracking.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think for me, it becomes really apparent now where the chancellor's perceived, fundamental red lines are. That, what are the things he really does not want to risk, and that is highly or politically or even militarily sensitive targets inside Russia being taken out by German weapons, especially if Germany is the only country that delivers weapon systems that can reach certain targets. I think that pretty much explains, right, why Taurus, after months of debate, is still off the table, because that's a long range strike weapon, or even a deep strike weapon, if you want to call it like that. That very powerful warhead that can engage pretty much any type of highly sensitive target. And that's a nightmare scenario for Scholz. And that's even with ATACMS, right? Like, given the more restricted range, this weapon system, even if it was fully allowed to attack, whatever target you want inside Ukraine, you would still have, some targets, especially more towards the decision-making centers in Moscow, that you could never reach with an ATACMS. So there would still be a great difference. And now I think why lifting those targeting restrictions for other types of German weapons was not such a red line as Taurus was, is simply because, given their range, given their capabilities, you have no possibility of engaging the types of sensitive targets that Scholz really, really wants to avoid being targeted with German weapons. So this absolute worst case scenario cannot materialize with this shift in policy, whereas in Scholz's mind, it could have very much materialized if Taurus was delivered. So I think that can explain quite well, at least in my mind, why a shift in policy was possible on this topic, in addition, right, to the United States following suit, while on Taurus, it was simply no inch more that allowed for scope for policy changes.
Yeah.
Right, and I think to germinate to Ukraine, I mean, we spoke about this the other day, is if we sort of play this logic forward that we've seen with obviously Leopard and Abrams, and now the revision and the targeting restrictions. If Taurus is to happen, I've come around to the conclusion that the only way it will happen is if the U.S. does, one of two specific things. Well, at a minimum, we would have to give them an equivalent weapon system and essentially make that risk assessment on Germany's behalf and indicate that we are either willing to take the risk of giving them JASSM-ER and trusting them not to use it in Russia, or taking the risk of giving them JASSM-ER and telling them to go nuts with it, and to essentially make that risk calculus and make that decision for Germany and for the rest of Europe by extension, and hope, in for a penny, in for a pound. The decision's already been made. We may as well just throw our lot in with it at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a good case to be made. I would say probably, at least with the current German administration of Scholz and his government, or probably not his government, just Scholz and his party, a U.S. change in policy would probably be more seen as a baseline, and it would still be a question whether Germany would want to follow suit. So I don't think it would necessarily be an automaticity at this point. So even if United States, delivered JASSM-ER, and even if they said, told the Ukrainians go nuts with it, even though I think, that would never happen. I'm pretty sure that if the United States were to deliver JASSM-ER, the only way that could occur is if it was highly restricted in terms of use, at least in terms of the types of targets, right? Even if we say, okay, that the range restrictions are fully lifted, the United States would probably still want to make sure that only military related infrastructure and targets are engaged. And I think if that were to occur, I think that would be seen in Berlin right now, at least as a baseline. But I'm pretty sure there would still be debate if you'd want to follow suit as Germany. And I really think that will or can only change fundamentally at this point if the government in Berlin changes. And given that we have elections upcoming in fall next year, and then with a new government coming in probably somewhere around spring 26, I mean, it's going to be interesting, right? Especially if you have a CDU-led government, a CDU chancellor who pretty much has indicated, all of the CDU has made clear, right, that they believe that delivering Taurus would be the right thing to do and should have happened a long time ago. So they're almost locked in, I feel like, at this point to then follow suit on that promise if it gets so far. But I think at least with Taurus, so to sum up my rant here, I think at this point with Taurus, it's so politically sensitive from a Berlin perspective that even if there was a change in policy to occur in the United States, I'm not sure that that would lift the ban imposed by the German government on these types of weapon systems. So I think even then, Scholz might still be, no, this is too risky, and I'm not going to do it.
I mean, they, although I completely agree with you, but they have time, right? I mean, integration, like fully integration into the Ukrainian platforms. So the Ukrainian fighter jets need some time, right? So it could be a debate of like 1 or 2 months, maybe 3 months, and they still would have time until they would officially deliver them to Ukraine because they need to be integrated anyways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think 1 or 2 months would be very optimistic. I'd probably longer. I would say like 3 to 6 months at the earliest after the government change. But yeah, that is also just speculation. That fully remains to be seen. Once we get there, and I think that's quite far out.
Well, in any case, I think that's a wrap for today. Thank you, Fabian, for joining us. We've loved having you. I hope you enjoyed your time here, and hope you feel like coming back in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. Great discussion. And anytime.
John, I have one comment because we got a few questions in the comment sections. Do you have time, Fabian, to maybe?
Yeah, sure, of course. I have all the time in the world.
Okay. Okay. The first one I saw was from Chris, I believe. Let me just bring it up. Yeah. So, yeah, has there been much coverage of this strike in Russian media? I'm surprised they haven't made a huge fuss about it. And I think he's referring to all the radar strikes.
So my loose understanding is Russian Telegram was screeching about it quite a bit, saying that it happened in April, but satellite imagery conclusively shows it occurred in early May. But I haven't seen Russian state media talking about it very much. But Russian Telegram was, of course, just beside themselves as always.
Yeah, and I think really again, right, the options for Russia to respond to this type of attack are really limited. Most likely, if Russia wants to react to perceived escalation from the Ukrainian side, typically what they've done in the over the last couple of months and years is that they have expanded strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and direct civilian targets, because there's really not that much that Russia can do in terms of expanding intensity and scope of the conflict right now in reaction to these coercive types of escalatory threats from Ukraine. And given this lack of options to respond, I think it's very much in the interest of the Russian state to keep that rather low. And yeah, I've also not seen anything, and I'm also pretty sure that's going to stay that way, exactly because of what I just said.
Yeah, the other thing is at a more, I guess, practical level, I assume, specifically with regard to nuclear signaling towards the US, France, and the UK, and also China and India by extension, given some of the coverage maps here. I don't think they want to let on anything about the state of their early warning capability. I think they just want everybody to assume that things are better than they maybe actually are.
Yeah, that could very well be. And also one more thing to add. Pretty sure the Russian reaction was probably backdoor channels to the United States telling them how mean that was and how awful and how destabilizing. So I'm pretty sure that was pretty front of the reaction from the Russians was targeted at the Americans, though not in public.
Oh, how terrible it is that a radar gets destroyed, but tens of thousands of civilians in Mariupol doesn't matter, right? Does it? Yeah.
So there was actually one question, Erlen, that I wanted to briefly address. I'm not sure who asked it. Somebody asked about Russian early warning satellites, the EKS constellation, also known as Tundra or Kupol. It exists, as Fabian said. There's 4 satellites in. They aren't in geostationary orbit. They are in. I think they have their own orbit, Tundra orbits, which is a polar orbit because they're trying to maintain loiter time over northern continental United States, specifically over the Minuteman III fields. It works. It's not a great constellation, as best I can tell. It's relative to systems like SIBRS, which is the U.S. Infrared early warning constellation that's in geostationary orbit. EKS is like hopelessly out of date. They literally reuse the imagers from their 1980s US KMO early warning constellation the Soviets developed. So it's not very good, but it should provide enough early warning for a launch under attack scenario or launch under warning scenario, excuse me. Though I'm sure the Russians would be uncomfortable with their confidence levels not having the ground-based early warning component.
Okay, I couldn't find the question referring to the satellites, but yeah.
There is also the other aspect of it is I'm not sure if this is still the case, but when the constellation was initially being deployed, it did not have coverage of some of the notional Trident patrol areas. So again, they plan to build out a geostationary component that will be able to provide complete global coverage in combination with the polar component over the northern United States. But if that hasn't been completed, then there is some possibility that it might not be able to detect Trident launches, say, in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah. I also, to add to that, I think one of the reasons why the reaction on the US side was probably rather strong towards Ukraine is that probably the United States is not that confident in this satellite constellation. And thanks, John, for correcting me that they're not geostationary. I wasn't aware of that, but that makes sense. Right, but in the past we had it during the Cold War a couple of times that these satellites they picked up reflections from clouds as launches from ICBMs, and basically what operators have then done in the past, they've waited until those warheads, if they had indeed been launched, would have been in range of those strategic early warning radars, right? To provide this second set of confirmation that either an attack is underway or to provide then confirmation that it was a false positive. And I think that's one reason why the United States is rather unhappy with this type of targeting, because they're not themselves too confident in Russian strategic early warning satellites, and they'd rather have Russia a set of capabilities to confirm that an attack is underway or not.
So, Erland, if you want to pull it up, I just sent you an image on Discord of the EKS constellation. That should be helpful. So I just checked the launch schedule. All 6 of they're in Molniya orbit specifically. All 6 of the polar component of EKS has been deployed and is operational, but none of the geostationary component has been launched. So there's probably a decent probability that they don't have as consistent and as high confidence coverage over some of the notional Trident patrol areas at lower latitudes, and also obviously the Indian silo fields and the Chinese silo fields as well.
No, yeah, it makes perfect sense. So again, that is one of the reasons, right? Why we would then be concerned if we're concerned about strategic stability on the US side.
Okay, thank you. So next question is from Thierry to John or Fabian. Could those strikes on early warning not have utility for former Ukrainian strategic ballistic strikes with new missiles currently in development?
Yes and no. I mean, in theory, absolutely. I think John can talk a lot better about the Ukrainian ballistic missile program, short-range ballistic missile program, and there's some work done there. So I'll let John speak on that. But I think, from a military perspective, I mean, if you want to have effect right now, you can have that effect because Ukraine is already launching ATACMS, short-range ballistic missiles, at targets in the south of Ukraine. So in that sense, I don't have to wait for an operational Ukrainian indigenous ballistic missile capability to have an effect when it comes to taking out that type of target.
Right. So to what Fabian was saying, the logic that's true of ATACMS with some of the specific radar sites providing potentially some early warning for Ukrainian tactical and short-range ballistic missiles, that would be just as true for, say, Sapson, if and when the Ukrainians are able to bring it into service in Erland. If you could pull up the other image I just sent you to sort of illustrate my point, there are two additional considerations here. Obviously, the stated range bracket is something like Sapson's greater than ATACMS. So depending on what they're targeting, particularly I think if they're targeting something in Russia, there might be more relative benefit to the Russians from having these operational early warning capabilities because greater range, greater time of flight, greater time at higher apogee, they'll get more early warning for something like, say, a Sapson raid against something in, deeper in Russia, say 500 something kilometers into Russia versus ATACMS being launched from Odessa Oblast towards Crimea. And then the other thing is there are other radars, other early warning radars in Russia that have some degree of coverage in Ukraine. And again, I hate to use his images. This is something that James Acton posted the other week as an example of two other early warning radars, one in Belarus, one in Russia, that has coverage over Ukraine. These might be other targets that or other installations the Ukrainians would be concerned about and potentially neutralizing it if they thought it would be an impediment to their ability to generate ballistic missile raids. Again, either with ATACMS against targets in Russia or a short depth in Ukraine, or a short depth into Russia if those targeting restrictions are ever further revised, or Sapson for deeper strikes into Russia proper.
Thank you. And then there's a question which not necessarily is relevant to this, but it's still on radars, and I think it's, it's kind of a big significant thing that was announced this week. The Swedes, they weren't allowed to send their Gripens, but something Swedish will fly over Ukraine anyways. And why for Ukraine? The Last Alliance asks. Given the Swedes' AVAX flight zone will be constrained by ORC SAMs, how many more of those of the map will the 450-kilometer radar range cover? Someone should do an overlay on the map.
So Ukraine already has fairly decent sensor coverage and effector coverage for cruise missile defense. Decent. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done. What the Area, the Swedish provided airborne early warning control platform, will let them do is not necessarily expand the size of their sensor envelope. It'll let them plug gaps in it. So there's a lot of gaps inside Ukraine where there's no radar coverage. This will let them have basically continuous coverage over everything in Ukraine during a raid. So that there won't be dead zones where Shaheds or cruise missiles can evade Ukrainian awareness or situational awareness. Essentially, that's what it will do more than anything else.
Yeah, nothing really to add to that. I think, of course, it depends a bit, right? To what extent they are able to seamlessly integrate that into existing sensor coverage. But then, from what I've heard, I don't think that should not be that much of an issue. So yeah, largely agree, or pretty much agree with what John just said.
So one question I have is, what sort of anti-air missiles would the Russians likely be trying to use to take this kind of platform down, and what kind of range does it have?
The concern, well, there's two principal concerns. There's S-400, SA-21 with 40 in 6, which is their 400-kilometer range active radar seeker surface-to-air missile, which is, the reference target for that is tankers and airborne early warning control platforms. And then there's R-37/R-37M axe head, which is launched by the MiG-31 BMs, and then the Su-35s. That would also be a concern. The ultimate issue that you run into, and I hope to God the Swedes have given this thought, once you include Belarus, everything in Ukraine is at least 400 kilometers away from the border. So, there's going to be some constraints on where this platform can operate. It's not going to be anywhere near the front line. The Ukrainians probably are not going to be able to use it very effectively for surveillance in either Russia or Belarus or in occupied Ukraine, just because of how far away it's going to have to be from the front line to avoid some of these threats. But it'll let them plug a lot of the gaps in their sensor coverage inside unoccupied Ukraine to prevent, cruise missiles or Shaheds from slipping through dead zones and sensor coverage.
Yeah, as you say, like if you put a 400-kilometer bubble around the occupied territories, Russian border, and Belarus, that's what's left, basically.
So, well, again, there's a lot of practical things here that limit the kinematics. 400 kilometers is probably only for a target that's not maneuvering at all. An aircraft like Air is not very maneuverable, but it can maneuver somewhat. That'll cut down the range. So again, all of this is quantifiable, but it's not quantifiable at an unclassified level. And I have to assume, God willing, the Swedish and the Ukrainian governments have done the numbers here, and they've figured out a rough concept of operations for how they want to approach this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if did anyone see any more questions for Fabian and John?
I guess maybe just one real quick question, I guess mainly for John, but of course if Fabian wants to comment on it. John, I know this week you had a couple of tweets just about, obviously the Gimlers were flying this week. It was a wonderful sight to see, but I know there was some interesting stuff with the serial numbers, and I'm just wondering if that tells us anything, or if it's just kind of a rabbit hole. And so just if you had anything generally to say about the Gimler strikes and then those serial numbers, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So just what I tweeted out. So the Russian Telegram had posted an image of what was allegedly Gimler's debris recovered in Belgorod, and it had a manufacturing date on there. Also the cage code. I pulled the cage code. It was produced by, I think, Cluj Industries. And what was interesting is the manufacturing date was September 07. M31 Gimler specifically, which is the unitary warhead, didn't achieve IOC, initial operational capability, and milestone C and full rate production approval until December 2008. So, assuming this is M31 Gimlers and not M30 Gimlers, that means this is one of the very first Gimlers produced from one of the low rate initial production lots issued prior to 2008. So this is very old. So M31A0. It also could be M30 Gimlers, M30A0, which is the OG Gimlers, the first one that had DPICM, payload dual purpose improved conventional munitions, the cluster munitions that we all know and love. That was already in full rate production at the time, so it could be one of those. And the Russian Telegram has been claiming that Ukraine has been employing Gimlers with DPICM inside Belgorod, so it could be that as well. And I believe M30A0 entered full rate production in 2005, so that would have been from a full rate production lot, if it is M30 and not M31. But yeah, they're very old Gimlers.
And you think that indicates anything, like that they're so old that like
No, I
Ukraine's
don't
shooting
think
the oldest stuff?
I don't think it indicates anything in particular. I would say that it would not shock me if we prioritized giving them older Gimlers rounds, just because they're older, they've depreciated more, lesser net book value for the purposes of determining presidential drawdown authority. So it makes sense from a sort of a financial management perspective, if you're trying to optimize there for send the most that you can with the available presidential drawdown authority, that you would prioritize sending the older stuff, because it's worth less and you can therefore send more of it up to the PDA cap.
Gotcha. Thanks. Thanks for clearing that up. So yeah, I think as Erlen said, I mean, thanks so much, Fabian, for coming on. We really appreciate it, and you're welcome anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.